Thank you very much, Ken. Appreciate that. And thanks to every one of you for being here this morning. I'm delighted to see you and to be back with you again for one more session. David Riley's in the house, so we're in good shape, David. It's been a good week. It's been my privilege to join you for this life application time. And we have just one left. The truth is we could go for many more, and I've been kind of sorting through what exactly to say today and how to end things today. What I've been talking about in terms of this model for family relationships is something that I will take an entire quarter to do with students. And so we're scrunching things down into a fairly brief component of time here. So here's what I've decided to do. We've taken a couple of important steps. The first step is to lay out the basic model. The model that talks about how God interacts with His people, what we've been referring to because of the family metaphors in Scripture as God's family, how God interacts with His family. And then we've talked some about how that ought to guide our thinking in terms of how we interact with our own families. We've considered why that goes awry at times. The two different foundations, one being covenant, the other being contract, and how while they look the same at ground zero, they are a bit different. And that minor sense of being askew, the more it lives out, the further it divides and separates. Now, the next thing that would be best for us to do would be to then talk about how each one of those four concepts, covenant, grace, empowerment, and intimacy, might get played out, might get lived out in a contemporary marriage and family, in a contemporary relationship between parents and children. So we're going to do that with just one of those concepts. We could take significant time with each of the four, but we don't have that time. So I'm going to, for the first three, just give you a brief word or two about each one of those and how those might flesh themselves out in a contemporary marriage and family. And then we're going to spend the remainder of the time on the fourth one. So if I could get the iPad up on the screen. The first concept is the concept of covenant. The question is, where does covenant get lived out in a contemporary home? And the answer to that, I believe, is in the area of commitment. Whoops. What did I do here? I'm still learning to use some of this, so let me try it again here. See if I've got it right. All right, here we go. In the area of commitment. In other words, if you want to ask, do we have a covenant marriage? One of the questions to ask about that is, how solid, how stable, how enduring is our commitment? The commitment that is made at marriage, if it's a biblical commitment, grows out of that first and foremost commitment in the Garden of Eden. Genesis 2:18, New Revised Standard Version, God says, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner." The sense of partnership is very strong. If you want to read about the partnership and the equality that existed at the time of creation, maybe the best I know place to read it is in the work of Richard Davidson, Old Testament scholar from the seminary at Andrews University. Really solid material. So that commitment that is made by these two human beings under the grace and the lordship of God is the commitment that becomes the covenantal bond that draws these two together. So we could take a lot of time and talk about that. Or there's the second concept, grace. Where does grace play itself out in a contemporary home, marriage, parenting, family? I think there are two areas we could talk about here. One is grace clearly plays itself out in the area of forgiveness. In fact, I would say to you, if you want to have a healthy marriage and a healthy family, you will have to, not may, But you will have to learn to say two things frequently. I am sorry. You are forgiven. If you don't learn those two statements, the amount, like I mentioned yesterday, of residue that will build up will at one point in time become almost impossible for the two of you alone to work through together. Christians who live in close proximity with other human beings, which is most of us, spouses or siblings or children or parents, have to become very good forgivers. The ability to extend grace is unmatched. I mentioned yesterday John Gottman in his research on being able to do repair work after conflict. It's so fundamentally important. So if you're a grace-based person, if you're seeking to live in a grace-based marriage, forgiveness is a key attribute of that experience. Now again, there is so much that we could say here, but we're going to move on. I think there's a second area where grace makes itself evident in a marriage, in a family, in our day and world, and that's in the area of flexibility. Flexibility. Grace-based people are flexible. They are able and willing to bend, to shift, and to change with the changing circumstances or with the changing requirements of the family life cycle. Meaning, as your kids grow older, you're able to flex and adapt and change. If you're treating them the same way when they're 17 that you were when they were 7, you're in deep trouble. It requires flexibility as life unfolds. The same thing is true with the circumstances of life. I don't know if this is true, but I'm going to take a guess that living in a tent at Big Camp probably requires a bit more flexibility than it does when you're living at home in your ordinary circumstances, especially when it gets cold, especially when it starts to rain. You have to be able to flex. Grace-based people flex. I have a stylus here that somebody graciously bought so that I could use this. Let me ask you a question. If I said, I am going to make this stylus flex, and I started to exert pressure in that direction, would it flex? No. One of two things would happen. If I wasn't strong enough, it would stay just like this. If I was strong enough, it would break. Two options. I'm rigid or I break. That tends to be true of people who don't have a grace basis. Very rigid. Everything is black or white, right or wrong, my way or the highway. In rigid systems, there's usually one person in charge at the top. That's often dad, but not always. And if you aren't that person, then yours is not to question why. Yours is just to do or die. That means there is a lack of a grace basis. So grace can play, again, many things, more things we could say there. A whole line of thinking about family systems that deals with this issue that can be very illuminating. All right, so forgiveness, flexibility, ways that grace plays itself out in a contemporary family. What about empowerment? I would suggest empowerment plays itself out in the area of authority. Authority. Authority is a sense of power that a person has. In a healthy family system, marriage or parenting, the authority gets shared. Children are raised so that they can become, in a healthy way, an authority in their own lives. When you have a 10-year-old, you want that 10-year-old to ask you, can I go here or there? When you have a 7-year-old, you want them to ask you, can I cross the street? When you have a 23-year-old, you don't want them asking you those kinds of questions. That's not what you raised them for. I know for my wife and me, as our kids have grown up and they've left home, Austin now lives several hundred miles from us. Miranda's in South America for school this year. And we talk with people at our church, and we commiserate and we moan about the fact that our kids grew up and left. But the truth is, that's what we raised them to do, right? I'm not sure we want them living at home at 33. Dad, can I go out till 9 o'clock tonight? In fact, I'm sure I don't want that. You want to raise them in a way that they can become their own authority in their own lives, under the authority and the lordship of Jesus. The way in which that happens is that you empower them. You empower them to make decisions. You empower them to face the consequences for their own decisions. The same thing, I might add, is true with spouses. There needs to be a healthy sense of power that is shared between the spouses. Anita and I, in our life and in our marriage at this point in time, talk all the time about all kinds of things. And it's just kind of this continual ongoing conversation of checking. It's not that we're getting permission. I was just on the phone and online with her this morning. I have a wedding on October 4. Do you want to go? Do you want to do this? She's emailing back, well, I have this, I have that. I'm not asking her permission, can I do this wedding? She's not asking me permission, can I go or not go? That's not what it's about. It's this ongoing conversation, just making sure we're on the same page. Each is empowered to have a healthy sense of who each one is. One of the really important places and ways that this happens is in the area of money. What happens with the money? Is there a sense of empowerment for each to be able to have a voice in what takes place? Now, there are different systems in terms of how you handle money that work for different people. I would recommend at least this. Let's, for the moment, assume you have two spouses that are working, either part or full-time. I would think that one of the important things is that both are contributing to the common fund or the common pot in a way that helps life happen, but that both have a certain amount, an equal amount of money that is their own, for which they don't have to answer. I would say that second part is true even if only one is working. Each needs to have some amount of money that will depend on how much it is that you make, but an equal amount of money for which you don't have to answer. That will help a great deal when somebody walks in from shopping, walks in with golf clubs, walks in with a new dress or whatever it might be, and the other says, how much did that cost? Those words usually lead to a fight. How much did you spend on that? If you're able to say, I spent my own money on it, then the other needs to back off. If you want to spend every penny of that, every pay period, that's your business. If you want to save it and spend it on something big 6 months down the road, that's your business. If you don't have something that is your own, how are you going to buy each other a birthday gift that's any surprise at all? A Christmas gift. How are you going to help a family member? So there needs to be this sense of empowerment that we can live in a way that recognizes not only the mutuality of the marriage, but also the individuality of the partners within the marriage. Okay, again, my apologies, but there is a lot that could be said on much further that could be said about each one of these. Now I'm going to erase these and I'm going to go, whoops, not sure why this is reappearing here, but see if I can get rid of all this. We're going to go to the last one. And we're going to go to the last one because I chose to spend our time on this one. Because what is contained here includes what may be, in my opinion, the most important reality of a marriage. So this is the area of intimacy. And the question becomes, how does intimacy play itself out in the context of a contemporary marriage? Now, one of the ways people answer that the most quickly, and I understand why, and I think legitimately, is that intimacy is played out in the area of sexuality. If you are able to ascertain the health the vitality, the robust nature or lack thereof of a couple's sexual life, you will probably have a pretty good sense of their level or degree of intimacy. I understand the thinking behind that. And I think it's fair to a point. I think it's fair to a point. I would, however, say that I don't think sexuality is the best barometer of the intimacy in a marriage. Because there are times and there are ways in which a sexual life may not be robust. And yet that may not be a comment on the emotional intimacy of the couple. Talk about distance, talk about illness, talk about the recent birth of a child, talk about a variety of factors. And it may not be an adequate statement about the robust nature of the emotional intimacy of the marriage. It is a good one, but I don't think it's the best one. However, I do have to say this. I do have to tell you a story. Are you familiar here with the name Ann Landers? Okay, some of you are. For those of you who may not be, Ann Landers was an advice columnist back in America and maybe in this part of the world as well. People were always writing in and asking her questions, giving her stories, etc. about different realities, and she would write them back, give them an answer, and it would be published in the paper. She has passed off the scene, but was very well known and was very much beloved. One of my favorite stories comes from Ann Landers. A woman wrote into Ann Landers and said, "Dear Ann, we just celebrated my parents' 50th wedding anniversary just this past weekend. And it was an amazing event, and it gave us the opportunity to talk about something that has been true throughout my parents' 50 years of marriage. They got married in a time where they had very little money. I think he was a police officer and she was a teacher. They had very little money, nothing really saved up. And so they took a honeymoon by just driving down the road to the next town. And stayed in again, I don't know what your hotels, motels are here, but back home be like a Motel 6. Very basic. Spent the night there and then drove back and went back to work. That was their honeymoon. However, said the letter writer, they decided at that time that they were going to save their money so that when their 50th wedding anniversary came, they would have a major vacation, a wonderful honeymoon. How were they going to save their money? Well, she said, this is what my mom and dad decided. They got a little metal box, and they decided that every time they made love, they would put $1 in that box. They didn't tell their kids this, obviously. But this lady, this daughter, grown adult daughter now, said, as each of us got married, my mom and dad gave us our own metal box and told us the story. She said, it was then that we remembered that often my dad would come home from work, say hi to us, the kids, to mom, and then he would stand there and look at my mother and say, I got $1 in my pocket. And that she would then say, I know just how to spend it. She said, I don't know how much my parents saved over the years, but I do know this. I do know that at the end of their 50th anniversary celebration, we took them to the airport. They boarded a flight to Hawaii, first class, with accommodations for, I think it was 12 days at a plush resort, and with plenty of spending money. And she said, as they turned to get on the flight, my dad looked at all of us. This was a few years ago, back in the day when you could actually go out to the gate and say goodbye to people as they boarded the plane. As they boarded the plane, she said, my dad turned around and looked at us and smiled and winked and said, tonight we're starting a fund for Cancun. I love that story because that story captures the essence of what marital sexuality is intended to be. Joyful, bonded, permanent, an experience that is shared between these two people. So if you're talking about that, then sexuality is a wonderful expression of intimacy. But I want to talk to you about a second one, and this is where we'll spend the rest of our time. I think there's actually a better indicator of a couple's, and in this case, a family's intimacy. And that is this word that we use so much when it comes to marriage and family themes. The word is communication. Communication. How well does a couple, how well does a family, how well do parents and children communicate? If you tell me, here's a couple that communicates very well, they're very engaged, I will tell you, then there's a couple that shares intimacy. If you tell me, here's a couple, here's a family, these people can't talk. They just can't. They can't somehow connect. I'll tell you, there's a person, there's a couple, there's a family that's missing intimacy. Because intimacy is maybe best expressed and best experienced in communication. In fact, a colleague of mine back in America says, the human organ of intimacy is the ear. The ear. That's the human organ of intimacy. That's where you determine whether or not two people are intimate. Are they able to hear one another? How well do they talk? How well do they listen? Now, I know enough about this issue of communication to say that if you ask a group of people to define communication, you will get a whole range of responses. It's talking, it's listening, it's spending time together, it's having nonverbal signals, body language that communicate, etc., etc. Many different definitions, and many of them, quite honestly, are good. Good definitions, helpful definitions. But what I've found over time is that some of the definitions we give to intimacy are not particularly helpful and are not even accurate. Here's the best definition I have found for intimacy. I don't know who came up with this. I don't think I did. I've said it enough that I'd like to believe I did, but I don't think I got it from me. I don't know who did, but it's an excellent definition of of communication. That is this. Communication is what happens when meaning is understood. Communication is what happens when meaning is understood. That means that to simply sit in the same room and talk does not guarantee communication has occurred. That means even leaning forward, using body language, using active reflective listening, doesn't guarantee communication will occur. Because communication does not legitimately occur until meaning has been understood. I could stand up here throughout the next media hora y hablar español y comunicar cosas de mucha importancia. Pero la verdad es que muchos se irían de esta carpa no understanding anything. And saying, it looked passionate, it looked good, it was great, I listened to everything he said, I could see his facial expressions, all of that. But I don't know what he said. Communication never occurred. It is not sufficient to be in the same space. It's not sufficient to talk, to seek to listen, to do all those things and say communication occurred. Now, having said that, let me ask you a question. I'm going to, in a sense, artificially separate two things, and that is speaker and listener. Speaker and listener. Both of those are vital to the process of communication. Would you agree with that? Both of them have to be engaged. Both of them have to participate. Having said that, for a moment, let me separate them. It's a bit artificial, I understand, but let me separate them and ask you this question. Listen carefully to the question. Which one of these two people, speaker or listener, which one of them determines whether or not what was said was understood? Let me say it again. Speaker and listener, they're both vital, but for a moment we're going to divide them. Which one of them determines whether or not what was said was actually understood? Now I'm going to ask you to vote. So I hope everybody will vote. How many of you would say it is the speaker who determines whether or not what was said was understood? Let me see your hands. Hold them up for just a minute. Okay, so we've got a healthy showing of hands. I don't think it's half, but quite a few. All right, how many would say listener? Let me see your hand. Oh, wow. Listener has won hands down. Thank you. I'm going to be on some thin ice here because I'm going to disagree with the majority. And let me tell you why. Now, remember, this is a bit of an artificial separation. It's a bit artificial because both actually have to be involved. But having made that separation, let me ask you this question. Who knows what is intended to be communicated? Speaker, exactly. The speaker is the one that knows this is the message that I'm trying to get across. The speaker knows that. Now, the listener has a very important role to play. The listener can make the decision whether or not to be engaged, whether or not to even try to understand, whether or not to ask questions of clarification to make sure that they're doing everything possible to get the point. The listener has a vital role to play. But at the end of the day, it is the speaker who knows what the message was, who is able to determine by the response, by the reaction, by the feedback, whether or not that message got through. Do you understand what I'm saying? Let me take it a step further. Suppose I were to say to you, now by the way, this is a test. This is just a test. Don't take this seriously. Suppose I stood up here and said to you, the tent's on fire. And you responded just like this. That's all you did was sit there and look at me. I would have to assume one of maybe two things. One is, you don't believe anything else I'm saying either. That would be one option. I've lost all credibility. Or, on the other hand, you didn't get my message. Right? You didn't understand it. It didn't register, didn't get through. I know what I'm trying to communicate. Your response tells me whether or not you understood that. I know this, sometimes painfully so, I know this as a teacher and as a preacher. Nose is itchy. Sometimes it's painful. There'll be times after a worship service somebody will come up and will say something to me. Maybe kind, maybe not so kind. You know, I totally disagree with what you said when you said yada, yada, yada. And I'm standing there looking at them thinking, when did I say that? That has nothing to do with what I was hoping to communicate. So either I failed to get it out there in an understandable way, or somehow between here and there it got waylaid, detoured, or maybe the filters you have in place didn't allow you to hear it in the way it was intended. But somewhere, as one character in a movie said, what we have here is a failure to communicate. Somehow it didn't happen. When I was a young pastor, pastoring my second church district, first church district after seminary, I read something that a pastor had done, and I thought, is that true? So I thought, well, I'll just try it at my church to see if that actually happens. So here's what I did, based on what I'd read this other person did. The next week I went to church, we had church and all the elements, preached, everything else ended. I walked out, and at that church we shook hands at the door on the way out. As people walked out the door and as I shook their hands, I said one thing to them over and over again. I smiled, I shook their hand, and I said, I have leprosy. Hi, I have leprosy. I have leprosy. Over and over again. You know what people said to me? They said, thank you very much. They said, God bless you too. I hope you have a happy Sabbath. That was a good sermon. I only remember one woman. It wasn't a huge church by any stretch, small church. But I only remember one woman who looked at me, pulled her hand away, and said, "That is awful," and then walked out, marched out. Only one person actually got the message. As a teacher, what if right now we were actually a university class and I said, "Okay, close your notes, close your notebooks, pop quiz, take out a piece of paper." And now I started asking you questions. How does covenant show itself in a contemporary family? How does grace show itself? Do you think I would be able, by grading your quizzes, to get a sense as to whether or not what I intended here got through to you? I would get a sense. It wouldn't be perfect. It wouldn't be fail-proof. But I would get a pretty good sense. If most everyone got the questions mostly right, I would say we're doing pretty well. However, if most everyone got it wrong, well, then a couple of things are going wrong. Either I'm not communicating it well, or I've lost the class and you're not listening. The speaker knows what he or she is intending to communicate. And by reading the signals, listening to the feedback, watching the actions, he or she can get a pretty good sense of whether or not that message is getting through. If you say to a friend, "I got a promotion at my job," and they burst into tears, something's wrong. Something is not congruent. That word congruent, something doesn't match. Need a couple of chairs here to show you something. Years ago, when I was first starting out my counseling, still doing my supervised counseling, I was in a very small office. And so when we were in this office counseling, it was kind of awkward actually because we were all so close together. I had this couple that came to see me. They were getting married, premarital counseling, and in the process of talking them together, it came out that she was actually somewhat frightened of him when he got angry. And so I talked to her alone for a little while to make sure that she hadn't been physically harmed, and etc. And then I talked to him. He is sitting in the chair across from me. Now remember, I'm not that far away. I'm just sitting kind of right there. He's sitting on the chair across from me like this. He's kind of up on the edge of his chair like this. He's not sitting back. He's up on the edge of his chair. He's leaning down like this, and he's looking at me. And I'm looking at this guy thinking, man, this guy looks like he's about to blow up. So I said to him, your girlfriend says to me that when you get angry, she gets kind of frightened of you. He looked at me, he goes, "I'm a very gentle man." I said, whoa. I said, really? I'm kind of looking at the door. How long would it take me to get out if something happens here? So I said, okay, all right. So, like, what do you do when you get upset? He said, "I just take her chin in my hand, and I say to her, I am not going to hurt you." Okay, time out. Where's my supervisor? This is too much. Because when I looked at that, the lack of congruence between what I saw and what I heard was striking. Understand that when you're seeking to communicate, what you say will typically be lost sight of by what people see. That's what they will tend to take in. That's what will tend to connect. So if you stand there with your child and say, "I love you," don't you understand that? No, they don't understand that. Neither would anybody else. Or have you ever... I have some friends back in America that are kind of strange people, but have you ever watched somebody sit and pet their dog so gently and say, "You're such a stupid dog. I just can't believe what an idiot you are." And they're petting and the dog is just lapping it up. And I'm thinking, man, they're saying the most awful things to this dog, and the dog is loving it because of what else happens. What else is happening on behalf of the speaker? So the speaker has a responsibility, absolutely. But communication hasn't occurred until the listener has understood the meaning. Now, I want to illustrate something by what sometimes family therapists will use. If they have a couple that has a great deal of conflict and is having a very difficult time talking to each other. Now, as I describe this, I'm going to tell you in advance, you're going to think, wow, that feels really mechanical. That feels so artificial. That feels plastic. How do people talk like that? I understand that. It feels that way, but then a lot of things in life can feel that way until you learn to do them well, right? Do you remember learning to drive I guess be on this side, a standard or a stick shift in your car? And we have a lot of automatics these days, and they're very easy. I remember trying to learn to drive a standard, a stick shift car, my older brother teaching me on an incline. And it was crazy. He'd say, okay, let out. And it'd stop. He'd say, come on, man. And the pressure was going up. I couldn't get... Do you know, after that, I owned 3 or 4 cars that were standard stick shift, and I did it every day, inclines, everything. Never even thought about it. Once I learned to do it, it was automatic. It flowed. So this will feel mechanical, but it's for a reason. So Jane and John come into the therapist's office. They've been fighting all week. They just can't seem to connect. Therapist realizes pretty quickly we're not going to get very far in this because every time there's just another blow-up. So he says, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to stop all this. I'm going to give you something, maybe a piece of carpet or a piece of tile. This is going to represent the floor. It's kind of corny, but it's going to represent the floor. Whoever has the floor gets to speak. So we're going to start here with you, Jane. You have the floor. Take just a brief time, 30, 40 seconds, no more than a minute, to put into words what you've been trying to say to John all week. So she has the floor. And she says, blah, blah, blah. This is what I've been trying to say. Then the therapist takes the floor and gives it to John and says, okay, now John, you have the floor. You cannot say anything in response to what she just said. Nothing. The only thing you can do is summarize what she just said. That's all. So give us a summary of what Jane just said. And so John says, she said, yada, yada, yada. Then he takes the floor back to Jane. Okay. All I want to hear from you is, that's what I said, he has it right. Or no, that's not what I said, and here's what I actually said. So he gives it to her, and she says, no, that's not what I said. I said blah, blah, blah. He said, I said yada, yada, yada. All right, well then say it again. So she says it again. Then it goes back to him. Now you summarize what she said. He does it again. This goes back and forth, going no further until she says what's on her heart, and he says, this is what she said, and she says, that's right. If that takes 1 or 2 times, if that takes 30 times, not until she says it, and he says, this is what she said, and she says, that's right, then the process reverses. Now, what do you say in response to that? And he says it. What did he just say? And she summarizes it. No, that's not. And back and forth. Who can have a fight that way? You can't even get the fight off the ground because you're spending all your time trying to decipher out what the other person is saying. In other words, what the therapist is trying to do is slow this couple down so that they are actually communicating. Communicating. The listener is catching the drift, getting the sense, understanding the meaning of the speaker. Now it's interesting. If you can get to that point, and if that is all you do in a relationship, just get to the point where you're actually dealing with what each other is actually saying, it's surprising how things can change. Because so many times, people end up fighting about things they're not really fighting about. They end up saying, well, that's not what I said. Well, that is too what you said. Well, no, I didn't say that. Well, I heard you. And I wish I had a recorder. I'd record that and I'd play it back to you. Who cares? Because the bottom line is what we have is a failure to communicate. Communication is what happens when meaning is understood. Now, I want to suggest to you that there is one reality at the heart of all conflict, regardless of what the individual theme might be. In other words, the individual theme today might be in-laws, or might be money, or raising children, or sexuality, or religion, or whatever it is. That might be what we're having an argument about today. That might be what's happening. Tomorrow it might be something else. The next day it might be something else. But regardless of what the individual theme is, I would suggest to you that there is something at the core of conflict that is in common as you move forward through a relationship. This is at the core over and over and over again, regardless of what the individual theme is. Now, this could be described in a number of ways. I'll say it this way. This issue at the core of so much conflict has to do with whether or not I feel that you are hearing what I am saying. Are you hearing me? Are you listening to me? Am I being heard? Is communication taking place? When we start to lose the sense that we're being heard, that's when our frustration and our anger starts to rise. And when it feels like the other person isn't hearing me, you know what I'm prone to doing? I'm prone to turning up the volume. Saying it again, only saying it louder. Did you hear that? Okay. And so it starts to get louder. And then we find other ways of turning up the volume. Storm out of the room. Slam the door. Call somebody a name. Squeal out of the driveway in the car. Stop talking for 3 days. That's one of the loudest shouts that some people make. Understand that underneath all of these actions is one plea. And that plea is, hear me. Listen to what I'm saying to you. And so we start to emphasize it, start to turn up the volume, start to lash out. But you know what happens? As we start to do that, the listener starts to erect more walls, more barriers. Who wants to be shouted at, right? So they just start putting up more barriers to hearing, which only makes the other person feel less heard. So now they come after it with more vigor. And pretty soon you're in a vicious cycle from which it's hard to escape at that moment in time. So that sense that you're hearing me or not hearing me is a keen, fundamental reality in human communication. Just think about it. Think about a time when somebody has not listened to you. Years ago, I wasn't too long out of school. I had a boss, a conference president actually, that I went to talk to about an issue dealing with my church and something he was asking that didn't seem to me it was going to work very well, and I needed to talk it through with him. Went into his office. It was a big office, and I went in. He had me sit on one side. He went over and sat behind the desk, so there was this big gap between us. And behind the desk, he looked very officious and was very scary to me as a young pastor. And then he said, "What do you need?" He said, "I've got somebody waiting on me for a letter, so go ahead." He picked up a yellow legal pad, and he wrote a letter while I talked to him. So I was over there talking, and he would occasionally look up at me and nod or grunt, and then he wrote a letter. When I finished, he said, "Well, I understand, but we need to keep it this way. Was there anything else you needed?" Now, I was way too young, way too wet behind the ears, way too green, and way too scared at that point to say anything else. I just said, "No, I guess not." I left, and I was fuming mad inside. Too threatened to say anything. But I thought, he didn't listen to me. He didn't even give me the respect of hearing what I was going to say. That was very painful as a young person coming into church work. I remember one other incident. These two incidents I remember with someone else. This was with a chaplain who was a boss of mine at Loma Linda University Medical Center. Different specifics, but the same in the sense that I needed to talk to him about something to do with work. I went into his office, pulled out a chair, told me to sit. He pulled out a chair from behind his desk. We sat facing each other. He said, "What's on your mind?" And I kind of laid it out to him. He was looking at me, listening, asked some questions, nodding. He clarified some things, thought it through, talked a little bit, and then finally said, I understand where you're coming from for this and that reason, but because of this, that, and the other, I really think, I'm sorry to tell you this, I don't think I'll make you happy, but I think we need to stay the course on this other thing. Well, I wasn't excited that he didn't agree with me. I'd love for him to have him agree with me. But when I walked out of his office, I wasn't angry. I didn't feel disrespected. I didn't feel minimized or put down. And the reason was simple. I walked out of there feeling like he heard me. He listened to what I said. He gave me the respect of eye contact, of emotional engagement, of questions, of explanation. It ended differently than I might have hoped, but I wasn't angry. I think those two incidents go to show me just how powerful it can be to help somebody feel like you are hearing them. In fact, I would say two things that I think are really important. Basic, they're very basic, but two basic skills that are important for helping manage conflict and ensure communication. They're not new, they've been around a long time. But somehow, even though they've been around a long time, we don't always practice them very well. For the speaker, I would say, use I language. I. Own your own experience. Own your own feelings. Own your own perspective. I'm angry about this. I'm upset that blah, blah, blah. I'm saddened by this. I hurt. I'm worried. Use I language that identifies this is how I feel. This is who I am. This is self-defining. In fact, you look in Scripture, God continually self-defines. Jesus self-defined all the time. I am the good shepherd. I am the light of the world. I am the door of the sheep. I am the bread of life. I. Constant self-definition. Use I language. That helps you to avoid blaming them. Rather than coming, well, you're always doing this and you do that, and when you do this, it makes me so angry. And people put up barriers, don't want to hear that. You can still be honest and clear and direct about what it is that you feel. For example, suppose you're going to a football match with a friend and your friend is late, way late. You're going to get there really late and you're angry. You have two ways you can handle that. You can go the you route. What's wrong with you? How'd you get here so late? You have some kind of problem getting places on time? It makes me so upset. You're always... About 2 sentences into that, they're angry. They're like, well, if you drove something besides this rat trap you call a car, we could still get there on time. I don't know what and now you're doing just this because you came out with both guns blazing. However, it is very possible to own it personally and still be very clear about how you feel without making them the problem. We're 20 minutes late. I hate being late. I like to get to the match early. That way I can buy some food, sit down, watch the warm-ups. I don't like being late. This has happened 3 times before. You know what? Next time, I'll give you the ticket. I'll meet you there. Because this is too big an issue for me. Are you unclear how I feel about that? No, it's still very clear. This does not work. This has been a problem before. It's still a problem. It needs to be something different. But it owns it. I am owning my own experience. I feel. Now be careful with this, because some people disguise attacks in I language. If you say, I feel angry, I feel sad, I feel hopeful, those are all feelings. Some people don't do that. They add that little word, that. I feel that. I feel that you've got a problem. I feel that you really have an issue getting places on time. I feel this so deeply. And then they're angry. You say, well, I'm using I language. And you say, well, it sure doesn't feel that way. Because all it is a disguised attack. To say, I feel that you've got a problem is not a feeling. That's a statement of fact. That's a belief. To say, I feel angry. I hate being late. That's a feeling. That's I language. So that may help the speaker in communication. What about the listener? How can the listener engage in this process? One of the best ways I know is one of the most simple. And that's active, reflective listening. Think about the things that make you feel like somebody is listening to you. And I'm going to guess it's going to be things like this: eye contact, body language, questions, nodding their head, shaking their head. Those kinds of responses tend to tell you somebody's listening. On the other hand, when you go to talk to your husband and the TV with the football match is right there and he's got the clicker in his hand and you're talking, he says, I'm listening. I hear, I'm listening. You're standing there saying, you may be able to repeat every word back to me, but you're still not listening. In fact, I've used Austin a lot, so I'll use him again today. When he was a kid, maybe 5 years old, I'd come home from work one day. I was going through the mail, getting out the bills, all these things, sorting things out, junk mail, and he was trying to tell me something. I don't remember what it was. Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. I was saying, well, I'm listening. Daddy, Daddy, I'm listening. Keep going through the mail. Daddy, Daddy, I want to tell. I said, I'm listening. I'm still going through the mail. Suddenly, this little child said to me, Daddy, listen to me with your eyes. I said, whoa. I put the mail down and I turned and I looked at him, and he essentially then said, now you're listening to me. Children can recognize it. Active, reflective listening. Here's a challenge I have for you. It's a very simple challenge, but I want you to try it. It's kind of like Naaman, his men came to him and said, come on, they didn't ask you something hard, just go dip 7 times and get out of the pool, see if it works. So just try it like that. Next time things start to get tense between you and your spouse, you and your child, next time things start to get heated up, make a conscious choice to listen and to visibly, physically communicate in those simple, clear ways, I'm listening to you. Look at them, ask them questions, recognize, mirror back what they're saying. Just listen and see what happens. I don't know what your experience will be. I can tell you what my experience has been. Most of the time, when people feel heard, their level of anger goes from here to here. It's not a magic wand that's going to fix every problem. But what it will do is it will help address that core issue that is present in conflict after conflict after conflict, and that is, you're not hearing me. Just look at them, ask them questions, give them feedback, listen to them. One person said it this way. So there's a 3-step process, very simple 3-step process to conflict resolution. Let the other person tell their story. Let the other person tell their whole story. Let the other person tell their whole story first. Now you may say, well, that's just trite wisdom from Reader's Digest. Well, maybe it is, but try it. Don't knock it till you've tried it. You will have the opportunity to say what you feel, your experience. You need to have that. But just give them a hearing. Give them a hearing. Now I want to say one more thing before we close up here, and that is this. I want to draw a distinction between conflict on the one hand and arguing on the other. Now, let me just check and make sure that the nuances of language in this sense between America and here are similar. Argument can mean something I do in court. An attorney stands up and makes an argument before the bar. It can be a political argument that political candidates stand up, and we're doing this a lot back in America right now, fighting to be the presidential candidate for either party and so forth. That can be argument. But in relational terms, argument or arguing usually implies that we're going after, you said this, no I didn't, well you did, and this is right. Is that the same sense? All right, good. I want to then to draw a distinction between conflict on the one hand and arguing on the other. I want to actually suggest to you, I'm not claiming I can live by this all the time, but this is my desire in prayer. I want to suggest to you that in relationship terms, husbands, wives, parents, kids, etc., argument is virtually never productive. It's just not helpful. It's just not good. I am not by that saying that doesn't happen in my life. It does happen, more than I might wish. But over the years, as learning and growth and prayer and all the rest, the incidence diminishes. But I want to suggest that argument is never good. Conflict, on the other hand, can be very good. You say, okay, are we just playing with terms? Is this just semantics? No, I don't think so. The purpose, the goal of argument, whether it's in the law court, in the political arena, or between a husband and wife, they all have one goal, and that goal is win. Win. I've got to win this thing. The defense attorney stands up and makes her argument before the jury with all the passion and conviction that she possesses, knowing that depending on whether or not she wins this argument, that defendant could go to life in prison or could be set free. Her goal is win, right? The political candidate stands up and makes his argument with all of his vim and vigor and vitality, knowing my ability to maybe one day sit as Prime Minister, maybe one day sit as President of the United States, depends on whether or not I win this argument, right? The spouse, the stakes may not be as high, but sometimes they would seem to be just by the passion we bring to it. And we're arguing over whether or not I said spend $20 or $25. And we're both dug in. We're going like this at it. The goal is win. However, here's the problem. Because a family is a unit, because a marriage is a team, when one loses, you both lose. It's just that simple. I'm a football fan back in the U.S., NFL, National Football League. The team for which I cheer is the Dallas Cowboys. We're 2 weeks into the season. First 2 weeks of the season, the two most critical players suffered real injuries. They're out for weeks. And now I check the internet, everybody's saying they're done. They're not going anywhere. The whole team is suffering because two people were injured. That's marriage. That's parenting. If you manage to beat your kids at the argument and walk away thinking, well, I guess I told them, well, maybe you did. Maybe you did win the argument. But at the end of the day, has that deepened your relationship? Has that increased the likelihood that they're actually going to do what you said as soon as you're out of sight? No. You walk away from your spouse. I guess I told her. Well, you did. Has that increased the strength, the maturity, the connection? Probably not. The goal of argument is win. Conflict, on the other hand, conflict is a human reality. A human reality that is not going to go away. It's an important facet of a marriage, of a family, of a community of people. We need ways to deal with our differences. We need to be able to bring them out, to deal with them openly. We need to be able to state what's in our minds, what's true for us, to hear what the others say. That's all healthy. I remember a woman I counseled early on who was very depressed. As I talked with her, here's what she said. I grew up in a home that had a lot of conflict. I hated it. What she was really talking about was arguing and fighting, but she called it conflict. Had a lot of conflict. I hated it. I decided that in my marriage there would be no conflict. We would not fight. And they hadn't. And she was clinically depressed. because she had spent so much of her life pushing down who she really was. I can't say that. I can't express that. I can't go there. I can't own that. I can't do any of that because that'll cause problems. Just depressing it until she ended up depressed. There has to be the ability to be honest, to be open, to be clear. This is who I am. That angers me. That upsets me. I'm glad to hear that. To be real with our emotions has to be there. Conflict is the venue. However, the goal of conflict is not to win. The goal of conflict is to understand and be understood. That's the goal. So that we've communicated authentically, legitimately. At the end of the day, we're both much more clear in our understanding each other. We may have agreed because of that and be at peace. Or we may come to it and say, okay, now I understand the issues. We simply don't see this eye to eye. Now we've got a choice to make. How do we go forward? If this is a major issue, we may need to sit down and talk with a counselor. If this is a more minor issue, then we just have to say, hey, live and let live. We agree to disagree. But at least we're dealing with the reality because the goal of conflict is to understand and to be understood. Now, the reason these two get confused is that both of them can have great emotion attached. You can be angry in conflict, you will be angry in arguing. We'll have some of the same kinds of emotions. So people can, looking from the outside, not immediately know the difference. But you can know the difference. You can know in your own heart, am I trying to understand her, understand him better? Am I trying to speak in such a way so that he or she can understand me better? If that's what's happening, you're moving in a positive direction with your conflict. I cannot probably adequately underline how important conflict management skills are in relationships. You can take a couple, young couple, thinking about getting married, that has many things that are positive. They come from similar backgrounds. They both love God. They're both church members. They're going in similar directions. All kinds of things. They laugh at the same jokes, enjoy the same sports. A lot of things in common. But they cannot manage conflict well. They end up arguing and fighting in a way that damages them both. You realize that one rotten apple can spoil the whole bushel. And I don't say that as an opinion. I say that with a mountain of research to back that up. Conflict can either help you or the fighting and arguing will immeasurably harm you. There's much in Scripture that's legitimate and valid and helpful. In fact, the last half of Ephesians is wonderful on this. Simple principles. Speak the truth, but do it in love. Let your words build up and not tear down. Don't let the sun set on your anger. In other words, keep your emotional issues up to date. A lot of practical wisdom. But I would suggest that this whole area of communication and conflict is probably the very best indicator of how intimate a couple or a family is. So there you have it. Somebody comes to me and says, what does it mean to be a Christian family? I feel like saying, you got a week? We'll sit down and we'll talk about it. Because I think those realities of covenant, grace, empowerment, and intimacy in their expression, in their divine expression with God and His own family, can become the formative principles by which we live in our families. And that when we do that, we are actually living out the intent of Jesus as a Christian family. Let's pray together. God of grace, thank you so much for your goodness, your love. Thank you for creating us as relational creatures, people who yearn for intimate connection with others. Lord, teach us the true meaning of intimacy. Bless us as we live in your family and in ours. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless. Thank you so much for the week.